I got to turn on the microphone. So yeah, they don't need to stay with your Drupal site. Once you apply them to Drupal, they're ephemeral. They can be just gone with the wind. So what do recipes do? They do 5 distinct things, and only 5 distinct things. The first thing they do is apply other recipes. So this is a chainable system of recipes. Like, we encourage people to build on top of other recipes. It helps with consistency, and you don't have to rebuild things over and over again, which is what the whole goal was. Then it installs modules and themes. After that, it imports configuration from various places, and we'll get into where in a bit. Then it runs config actions, which that is the act of altering configuration files that either you just imported or were already in the system. Before, you would only need like Drupal update hooks to do that. And then finally, it imports content. So Jim, why do we need recipes? We already have modules. What recipes do different than modules are build on top of each other, that systematic approach. They import configuration entities selectively. So when you install a module, normally when you just do drush en or click the module in the UI, you get all of the configuration entities. These are things that build on top of the module structure. With recipes, you can be selective. So if you don't want to, you install the meta tag module, but you don't want the front page meta tag default, you can create your own. You don't need to import it. You don't need to import the files view that we always turn off from the media entity or media module. After that, altering existing configuration using actions, that makes it much easier to, say, change the site email. Like, you could never, with a module, unless you wrote PHP code, change config that didn't belong to your module. Importing content, we borrowed this from the default content contrib module. The importer is now in Drupal core, so you can create content entities and import them into Drupal. Super useful for providing demo or default content, taxonomy terms that you can use to filter your views. You know, if you're setting up a calendar, why not load it with event type taxonomy terms? And then the last thing is accept user input and apply at any time. So when you apply the recipe, you can ask the recipe applier for input. And you could also provide input from configuration. So a great example of that is the contact form recipe in Drupal core. It sets the recipient of the contact form to the site email. We know the site email is going to be in one of the system configs because it's required by Drupal core. So you can define variables based on config you know exists, or you can ask the recipe applier. So what do recipes can't do? So recipes can't contain any code. No PHP, no CSS, no JavaScript. It can't make any decisions on its own. We try to limit the choose your own adventure book path of recipes. We want recipes to do their job and do it well. It makes them predictable and a lot safer, that you're not going to bork somebody's site by applying a recipe. They can't contain other recipes. So like the way modules contain submodules is a very Drupal thing to do. We want recipes to each have their own packages. So it makes a little bit harder developer experience that you have to have recipes all over the place, but it makes it a lot safer, and we don't have to discover where recipes are. You require recipes with Composer, they always end up in one place. They can't be updated. So once a recipe is applied, it's applied, and we're done. You know, this solves a certain set of problems. It doesn't solve all problems, like where you do want to update things in the future. Install profiles and modules are still better for that. And we've made the decision that we don't want recipes to be destructive. So they can't delete any configuration. They can't uninstall any things. You can sometimes unset configuration because those are values in config files, but we don't want to get to a point where we're deleting a config, but like this entity over here actually needs that config, and you're going to white screen your site the next time it's in there. So let's get into using recipes. The core recommended template, if you're starting a new project, contains an installer path for recipes. So anytime you compose or require, we recommend that you put recipes above the web root, because again, they're not part of Drupal core. So they're next to your config file. So if you're adding them to an existing project, you need to just add this small snippet to your installer paths to tell Composer where to put recipes that you're requiring. When you require a recipe, puts it in a specific spot, and because this is a Drupal core initiative and Drupal core code, we use the Drupal PHP script. It's not very widely known, but Drupal has a PHP script that you can use to apply recipes, which is that core scripts Drupal, then we have a recipe command inside that script, and then the path to the recipe. But thanks to Drush 13, you can now just say Drush recipe and then the path to the recipe, which makes it a lot easier. With the core script, that actually needs to run from the web root, so you'd have to cd into the web root first. Drush always runs from the web root, I think. So you can just run Drush from anywhere. You can also apply recipes through Project Browser. So Project Browser allows you to install modules and apply recipes. Currently, the only implementation of a Project Browser that we know about is in Drupal CMS. The recipes are hard-coded in the Project Browser, or available to it. And you can apply there, and they even let you reapply recipes, which is a cool thing. But additional browsers can be created in the future for Project Browser. So you think a university that only allows certain recipes to be applied, or a big organization that has hundreds of websites, you can create your own Project Browser and list only the recipes that you approve for your folks. So I touched a little earlier on creating recipes. The first thing we encourage is to extend core recipes, especially like media entities. Like, if you ever install Drupal with the minimal install profile, and you're like, where is media? Well, that came from the standard profile, which we recreated as recipes. So we made them very granular, so you can just install the image media entity. You don't need to install audio. Like, who uses the audio media entity? One on every 50 sites. We encourage you to make small recipes that are composable and buildable. When you are creating recipes and you're collecting configuration, so the standard process for a recipe author is usually to build something on a site, click it together, export the configuration, and start pruning through it and looking through what you made and putting it into a folder. We want you to remove the UUID and the core values from the recipes. Those make it unique to the site that you're working on. Once you pull those out, they can be installed on any site. Generally cleaner too. When you're ready to share your recipe, create general projects on Drupal.org. This is just a type of project instead of a module project or a theme project. The general project, in your composer file, when you say Drupal recipe as the composer type, it's shared through Drupal's packagist. So you can then require Drupal/recipe name on your site, and you got it. The only thing that's odd there is that when modules and themes are put together, the packager on Drupal.org puts a license file inside of there. So to keep in good standing with the open source community, we recommend putting your own license file into your repository yourself. We just copy Drupal cores, so we have the same exact license there. So we got Drupal recipes into core in 10.3. This was May 7th, 2024. less than a year ago. It seems like a decade ago to some of us. Recipes were very strict. There was a very limited set of config actions. Everything worked great, but as we made more and more recipes, as we worked on Drupal CMS, we made a lot of improvements. So I'm going to step through those right now after I get a little sip of water. Oh, no, but first I'm going to explain what is in Drupal core. Let's do that first. Okay, rearrange the slides. All right, there were 4 APIs that we put into Drupal core. Config action, config checkpoint, default content, and recipe. So the config action, config checkpoint, and default content, they all live by themselves. So config actions, like we created them for recipes, but other things could use config actions. So we're talking about maybe having a ECA, an event condition action that could apply a config action. Your custom module could use config actions. Config checkpoint is created when you are applying a recipe. Default content is what consumes default content entities. And the recipe API depends on all 3 of those. So as the recipe gets applied, it runs through all of these. So config action, if you're using it in a module, that's where it is. But I'm not so modularly, so I put down actually where it is in core if you want to go check it out. But it allows us to alter configurations in specific ways. It can be applied to existing config or config you just imported, or if you used a config action like create if not exists, you could then use config action after that. For the module developers, config action can be wrappers around existing entity methods. Or you could just write your own config action from the beginning. And then config actions are provided by modules that are in Drupal core. So like a config action that can be applied to the block module or blocks are in the block module. If it's in the CK editor, it's in the CK editor module or the editor module, or your custom module. And we actually have a citing. The first ever contrib config actions were done by the search API module for Drupal CMS, or to lay the groundwork for that. So we hope to see more and more contrib modules create config actions as they need them. It's a way to alter config. Yeah, so the config files stay the same, but if you need to make changes into the little itty bits of the config file, you need specific config actions to change this. So, a entity view display will have third-party settings. So like scheduler and layout builder go into third-party settings. So we have a config action that specifically allows us to change third-party settings in a config. So there's a lot of different little pieces. If a meta tag module creates their own configuration, maybe they want to provide a way to alter that configuration. So with the config checkpoint, that creates a snapshot of the configuration on your site as it is before the recipe applies. And if something happens, a failure during that application, it reverts to that snapshot. So this is basic groundwork for the validation work. And again, us trying not to bork your site. But in a 20-year vision, maybe we can do things like revert a recipe application. But don't expect that anytime soon. Default content allows us to import content configuration entities. So just like Drupal has your big config file, the default content module created a way for you to upload content. So you could save a taxonomy term, you could save a node in structured way. We took that API, we took their exact code, put it in for the importer. You still need the module to export code from the site. It gives you a drush command. You run drush dcer. then the node ID, and it'll export a config file and all the dependencies. So if you had a taxonomy term that was referenced from a node, it would export the taxonomy term, images that are on their files, all that kind of good stuff. So this is a very, it's kind of an existing module, has been around forever. There isn't a lot of work on it. So like this initiative, we took this code and used it because it is great as at a certain point, but there isn't really a team that works on it or is going to improve it anytime soon. And then the recipe config relies on those three and then steps through the different recipe runners that I explained earlier. So since then, there's been a lot of cool stuff. The first up is that we changed the config action nomenclature to camel case. So initially, we had some camel case, we had some snake case, I think it's called, with the dashes in there. So we did it in a deprecation way. So right now in Drupal 11, simple config update works, or simple underscore config update works. But in Drupal 12, it'll be deprecated. So when you're writing your new recipes or updating your recipes, just check out what the new names are. Recipes can require input. So I talked about the content form module that sets config. If you use Drupal CMS, the AI recipe asks you for what your keys are for which AI provider you're doing, your secret and your key. So there was two issues. The first issue that we got in was that you could get input on the command line. And then there's a set of configuration in your recipe where you can define a question to ask on the command line, set a default if you want. And then the second issue was that we allowed the creation of Drupal forms for that. So the second issue is what made Project Browser work. A recipe author, like the AI recipe team, they made it both. So if you install it by the command line, it'll apply, and you can, or in Project Browser. So that's a really good recipe to look at. Config strict. To me, this was the biggest pain point about the first iteration of Drupal. The configuration validation in recipes is so strict that if one tiny little thing on a config file was different in your site, the whole recipe would blow up. So like with a media image, if somebody uploaded a default image or changed the path to where the images were stored or whatever, like your whole big site installer recipe wouldn't work. So the introduction of config strict in the recipe YAML allowed us to say false. We don't want the recipe to be strict. So it is strict by default. You just change it to false if you wanted to skip them all. That's generally safe, but we recommend anything that structures the database, so like node storage configs, field storage configs, you set those individually. So like field storage, foo, and taxonomy, vocabulary, bar, like we expect those to set the database in a general way. So we set those at strict. When we set the individuals files as strict, all other configs are set leniently. So that's a good way to do it. Like if you have 500 configs in your recipe, but you really care about 4, the other 496 are fine. Yeah. Extra is a fun one. So because recipe YAMLs are validated so much, if you put in like author or something like that, it's going to fail because we're not expecting author. So we allowed an extra section, just like composer JSONs have an extra section, to allow other things to hook into it. So the first expectation is that Project Browser is going to use that to allow recipe authors to do things after the recipe is applied. So right now you click the button and apply a recipe and it's just like recipe applied. Okay, great. You know, maybe we want to pop up a message that says, thanks for applying the recipe. You know, here's what to do first, or here's where to go next, or redirect the user to a dashboard page or something. So it's kind of like we allowed the framework for other people to take advantage of the next steps. This is a cool, powerful config action, or it's a config action wildcard, we like to call them. So we can create entities for each node type based on something. So in this example here, we're using the create for each if not exists. So this is saying we are going to, anytime a node is created, a bundle type, so I made a new bundle type called article, I can use this bundle variable and create a config for it. This is really good with the language. If your site's multilingual, we want to create a language setting for each new article type that we created, each new page type. You could do it for image styles. Under each config, you can set different things in there. So this is a very powerful wildcard tool that we found. I think it was the language or the multilingual recipe team needed for it to exist. You can clone config entities with a new ID. So this is a really cool example for image styles. I know if anybody here has created image styles for a site, especially like with the responsive image styles, there can be hundreds and hundreds. But you could create a recipe that clones your one perfect image style and then clones it as another name, and then applies a config action that could maybe say change the image size on that image. So you could set up a repeatable pattern where you could just bulk generate configs from a recipe. This was us branching out a little bit more. So Core's layout builder module was the first to get some really specific config actions for themselves. So there's 3. Allow layout overrides, and that's just a true or false. And then you can say enable or disable. That's just an empty array that you put in there. Another one that came from Drupal CMS, add blocks to navigation. So the navigation module in Drupal core allows you to add blocks. You know, usually it's menus that you could throw in there, but you could throw other things in there. This allows you to programmatically add a block to navigation. I mentioned unpacking earlier today. This has been a 3-year issue that we've had open. So when you require a recipe, your recipe has a composer.json file and it has dependencies. There could be modules, they could be JavaScript packages, like anything Composer can require, right? If you apply the recipe and remove it, Drupal has the stuff that you need, but the next time you run Composer update, you might not have those modules that your recipe required. So the idea of Composer unpacking is going to be a Composer plugin that you can run Composer unpack, or it's going to be part of the recipe application process, where it automatically takes from the recipes composer.json, takes all those dependencies and puts them up into your project's composer.json. So again, it's really ephemeral that the recipe comes, your site has Drupal has the stuff, and your Composer has the stuff that you need moving forward. So that's an open issue. We're actively working on it. Adam back here, Alex in London, Robert in Texas. Yeah, it's a global team that is all trying to figure this out. And new in contrib, I mentioned the Search API config actions. There are 2 types of config in Search API. There's the index and the server. So these do specific things inside of Search API module to help you configure that out of the box. And new yesterday, the recipe tracker module from the team behind Drupal Commerce. So Drupal core doesn't need to know about what recipes are applied. we don't care. We want to have that decoupled nature. You know, like we've learned from distributions and install profiles where, you know, some of those tools are needed, but a lot of times they're not. So we want to be completely decoupled from recipes. But, you know, Project Browser tracks what you are applying if you use the Drupal CMS. It does it so it knows if you want to reapply the recipe. This team anticipates a lot of support requests in how sites were put together and what recipes were used. You know, again, to Drupal core, we don't care because it's the same as, hey, you inherited this site that 4 agencies have worked on and people have clicked together a million different things. And even I don't remember what I did a month ago, never mind 4 years ago. So you got to look at the current state. But, you know, they see value in tracking the recipes that are applied. Looks interesting. I haven't played with it yet, but it creates a new entity in Drupal that logs every time you apply a recipe. So very cool and innovative. You know, just because we're not doing it in Drupal core doesn't mean it can't be done in Contrib, which is great. So there used to be this great restaurant in Cicero, Illinois called Kloss Restaurant, this old Czech restaurant, and they had a sign on the bathroom that said, "Do not do rapid flushing." So that's always been a private joke to me. So we're going to go through anti-patterns now of things, you know, we see in recipe creation. And the biggest one is that there's 2 types of configuration files. So there's simple config and configuration entities. Simple config are when you do the config import, you don't even need to care about it because simple config from a module is always imported. That's user.settings.yaml, metatag.settings.yaml. But the configuration entities are things with 3 dots, so like node type article. So like node.settings exists in Drupal, and Drupal always needs that, but Drupal doesn't need your configuration entity. It doesn't need to have node.type.page, right? So we have this simple config update, and it's kind of like our 5-in-1 tool. We actually allow you to use it on configuration entities right now, but like bad validation things can happen if you do that. So we're trying to get more specific with our configuration actions. So we already have set and set multiple. These are wrappers around this Drupal core's set entity method. And again, they're kind of generic. What we're working on right now is a set properties config action that will work on configuration entities. It'll be an easy switcheroo to replace, and it'll be a much safer thing for the long run. So again, we'll deprecate that in the current Drupal version, and it'll be removed in future versions, and you'll get warnings and stuff. Don't call your recipe Drupal CMS. We've seen at least one version of this already. Drupal CMS is a collection of recipes curated by a specific team. Recipes can be created by anybody, but Drupal CMS recipes should be created by people that work for Drupal CMS. Don't blindly copy, paste config from your site into your recipe. It can lead to a lot of bloat and a lot of configuration your site's not going to need or your recipe doesn't need. You can do a lot of things with config actions where you don't need to have extra files in the config folder. Don't copy config from modules and then into your recipe and then like change one thing. Rather, use the config import to import that config and then use a config action to change that one little thing. It'll help make it more item potent where you can apply that recipe again, and safer for being able to apply to another recipe. So if I did that, if I took redirect module and changed a piece of config and put it in my recipe and tried to apply that on a site that already had the redirect module, it would fail because those redirects or those configs weren't the same. And then, yeah, use config strict to ensure that the specific config is the way you need it, and then everything else is Oh, all right. So I wanted to share some more advanced recipes, if that's okay. Um, let's see if this works. Hey, it does. Okay, this is me. I taught myself the input last week. So this module configures the OpenID Connect module. So if you've ever configured, if you've ever logged into a website using Google or Facebook, like this is a really easy way for your Drupal site to do that. But the OpenID Connect module allows you to use Facebook, GitHub, Google, LinkedIn, Okta, and then like a generic one that like say your university created. So up here, let me see if I can make this bigger. Yeah, all right. Okay, so at the top, I install the Views module, the OpenID Connect, and the OpenID Connect requires this external auth module as a sub module or a dependent module. Then we ask for input here. So the first thing in an input is basically like the field you want to ask. So the first one is a client type, and I wanted to use a prompt. So on the command line, this gives a prompt, and it says, what service would you like to connect to? And then gives you 7 choices. It has a constraint of not blank. We need a value here. I didn't want to make a choice for them, so that like the default is blank. Here's the form. So like this is ready for Project Browser or another tool that would let you apply recipes. So in that form, I use radios. Same thing. I say, you know, what do you want to do? And I give it the options in the Drupal format. I repeat for the label, since the first one is a machine name, the second one is like the label. We could call it Google connection number 1, Google connection number 2. Then the client ID and the client secret. I don't love that this module doesn't use the key module. I'd take a different approach if it did, but this is the way this module works currently. In this case, I set config strict to false because I don't care if any of the config matches. This can apply, and it doesn't really matter. I import a configuration file from the external auth module. It's a view of connections, or actually it's a view of like the user connections to the site. So that's why I require views up above, and I import the config. I don't need to put OpenID Connect here because it doesn't have any configuration entities in itself. It will create the configuration entities in a minute, but it doesn't ship with configuration entities. I use, it does have a simple config, so it comes with this OpenID Connect.settings, and I use simple config update to change a piece of the config, so I put my login buttons for GitHub and Google below the user form, if it's there. Then I use the variables from the input I was collecting in the config actions section. So in the first one, I am creating a configuration entity called client type. So I set the top up as Facebook, and so now I create a OpenID Connect client Facebook. So I create, if not exists, this will bypass if I already have a configuration entity named Facebook, and moves down. And then I set a bunch of properties inside of that. So I use the set multiple config action. I set the ID to the client type. I set the label, and then I use, these are nested, so I have to use the simple config update for now, but I set that API ID and key here. And then the last thing I do is set permissions, general permissions. If you're logged into the Drupal site as an authenticated user, you can connect to anything you want. So the great thing about this recipe is I ran through it. It's all idempotent, so I can choose Facebook the first time, and then I can immediately reapply the recipe and select Google, and then reapply the recipe and select Okta, or whatever else. So it's a way to like rapidly iterate. You could click through all the screens and do it yourself, but this way you can just do it on the command line or do it in something like Project Browser. And it's a nice, helpful module that would like help Drupal development teams rapidly iterate on things. Other one, how are we doing on time here? Well, that's pretty good. If you want to talk recipes, you should definitely find me and I can show you more nerdy examples. Yes, sir.
Can I just point something out about this recipe? There's a mistake in here.
Oh.
I saw it. I was like, do I say something?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. If you go up to the client type, this is a mistake that we actually made in Drupal CMS, and it broke us pretty badly. So if you go up to client type, you'll see that you say constraints. There's a constraint for not blank. And what that's basically saying is this thing cannot be blank. But then a few lines later, it has default value, which is blank. If you try to put that recipe through Project Browser, you will get a nasty error, because what's going to happen is it's going to start with the default value and then immediately validate and say, hey, wait, this is no good. I'm going to freak out now. So what this means is that you cannot be, for any input, you can't give it a default value that is not valid. They always have to have valid values. What I would do in this situation, if you like we faced this problem in Drupal CMS a couple of times, where we need an API key, it can't really be blank, but we don't have a realistic default to provide. The way we got around that is we just don't validate it. We just don't put the constraints on there. It's like, and the reason that that's reasonable is because it's the same thing as if somebody installed, say, the Google Analytics module and just didn't put an API key in. It won't work, but that's not our problem. That's the Google Analytics module's problem.
Okay.
We don't have to worry about it. So that's how I would get around that in this case, but just don't do default values that are no good.
But default value is required, but constraints are not.
Correct.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you.
Sorry.
No, this whole half a section was things we learned from Drupal CMS, so we might as well continue. So yeah, let's get out of here if we can. And what's next? So if you're here and you want to contrib, we're doing two things because we don't have a lot of developers on this project. We're going to triage the project issue queue. So for a couple of years, we worked on a fork of Drupal. It was the distributions_recipes project. And we, since we launched 10.3, we kept it around thinking we might use it, but we never did. So we're going to take those issues, and we've solved a lot of issues that haven't been touched in a long time. So we're going to do triage on tomorrow and Thursday to see if the old issues are valid, and then if they are, we're going to move them to the appropriate place in Drupal core. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to continue to iterate and improve on the documentation. So that project has a 1.0 branch that has a lot of documentation. It has a list of every config action that I know to exist, has a lot of step-by-step guides. We want to turn that into make docs and have it be more publicly available and easily readable, so like people don't have to click into the code and click into the 1.x branch to find the documentation. So if you're not necessarily a developer, but can write good words and come help, I definitely appreciate the help there. I mentioned earlier we have the recipes channel in the Drupal Slack. Adam and I love to help anybody out, answer questions, give general direction and advice on recipes. We do in that channel have a twice monthly asynchronous meeting. It's probably overkill because we answer any question that anybody asks us anyways. We have a phase 2, which we'll probably work on tomorrow and see where we are on the roadmap. So there's one kind of big meta issue. There's the recipes initiative tag on Drupal.org. So because now we've moved out of our single project and spoken out into all of Drupal, we try to tag recipes-related issues with the recipes initiative tag, so we can have a collection of the recipes and then the documentation. So thank you. I would love to take any questions if people still have time.
maybe over a simplistic question, I'm not sure, but until unpackaging is ready, what is like the current workflow besides the obvious? Like, or is it like just composer required, composer removed, necessary? Like, you got to go hunting for what?
Sure. I'll repeat the question into the microphone. The question was, until unpacking is ready, what do we do now? There is a proof of concept unpacking plugin by a developer from Evolving Web. We have a link to it in the station. So basically, that's apply the recipe, unpack the recipe, remove the recipe. So it works well. It just is never going to get into core like the way it is. It was just a quick proof of concept that we've been running with for 2 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like how and at what points does the config checkpoint work? Like is that just when the recipe is installed?
Yeah, just during the application process. So recipes aren't installed, they're applied. And yeah, so it creates the checkpoint. I know if the config is the same, so like the second time you do apply a recipe and there's no changes, like it wouldn't create the config checkpoint. It's a little smart. So yeah, the recipe runner calls the config checkpoint API, makes that backup, and then if the recipe application fails, it goes back to that backup.
Does like the whole site config or is it just that one config that's
Whole site config?
I think it's just the bits and pieces that
Change,
change.
okay.
Does it run only for the recipe that was invoked to be applied, or does it run for, or do we have a checkpoint for every sub recipe?
We think it's we think the config checkpoint is just for the config that you're changing. So yeah, it's not. I don't think it's like config sync where you export your whole config. So that's why, I said maybe there's recipe undo, recipe revert in the future. It gets really hairy because the second you start changing a config after that recipe has been applied, what are you going to revert to? Are you going to break something else that has happened since then? So yeah, it gets really hairy there.
You said no sub-recipes? Is that?
Yeah, so there's only 2 places you can store recipe. There's no discoverability of recipes. So, like Drupal modules, Drupal can look into the modules folder and custom contrib George, Harry, it will find your module. But recipes only know about siblings of the folder that they're in. So if you keep all your recipes in a single folder, then each recipe could be dependent on each other. And then the second place, which is hard-coded, is /core/recipes/recipe name. So that's like a special use case. You could have nested recipes. You could have a folder that has four.
I got one. That's why I was wondering.
Sure,
Yeah.
but your recipe can only depend on recipes that are in that folder. So it's a self-contained nested recipe. So yeah, which is fine, right? If you want to do it that way, that's great. Modules could ship with recipes. If we've seen modules with recipes folders in there, but it couldn't depend on a recipe that's over here. So, it's an idea a lot of developers want to share, ship their module with a recipe that does something to the recipe, but like they could just as easily use config actions. Our recommendation would be you have the recipe, which is the first-class citizen, and the module is actually, called from the recipe. So like that's more of the use case we're trying to set up. The question is, if a module has dependencies, do you have to declare the dependent modules to be installed in the recipe? The answer is no and yes. So if your recipe doesn't need to know about that module, then you don't need to have it installed. But if you were to have like a config action that altered a config from that dependent module, then the validation step would say, hey, you don't have, the submodule that you need to depend on that. But yeah, if it's just for a dependency of the module, the recipe doesn't need to know about it. Yeah. So I tend to be err on the side of caution and make sure, like, be declarative. Like, I want these modules. So yeah.
I don't see this mentioned a lot, but you talked a lot about like applying recipe on existing Drupal instance. But from my experience, you can also install the site from recipe, right?
You certainly can install a site from a recipe. And I'd say most of the recipes in existence, that's what they are. They're big, huge site starters. They're like, here's my agency Drupal starter that we created, and it was a distribution, or actually we'll go back here. It was a Drush make file, and then it was a distribution. Maybe it was an install profile. Sometimes we did custom modules. So yeah, there are a lot of those. The Drush SI can take an input from a recipe, so you can say Drush site install standard profile or standard recipe or your recipe. So yeah, there's a lot of things out there. When we got to Drupal CMS, though, not everybody needs everything. So we broke out the content types into their own recipes. There are certain starter recipes that are always applied under the behind the scenes, but the idea of creating these more as reusable things will allow greater shareability, greater standardization, and greater efficiency and performance for our clients.
One of the main problems I've had with recipes over the years is that when I'm trying to apply a recipe and it fails, being able to distinguish what the messages are, or even have strategies on how to troubleshoot them, especially when you have a recipe that'll work here but won't work here.
Yes, one of the problems with recipes is that when recipes fail, it is sometimes hard to deduce what the failure was. I see a lot of CK editor errors that we're like, what? I didn't install that or anything like that.
So I keep coming up with the layout builder dependency.
Layout, okay, yeah. So, I've found that, yeah, it usually is a dependency of a dependency of a dependency. This is a developer pain point right now.
But don't know where to even start to try to figure out, well, how can I get this to work?
Yeah.
Other than just deleting the
To-
big action.
Yeah. Alex, sorry, Adam, you have any ideas here?
This is definitely a known pain in the ass. I
I'm
run
not
into it
alone.
too. This happens to me sometimes where like I'll have a recipe fail and the message will have just nothing to do with reality. It's like, yeah, I've seen CK editor stuff. The reason this is happening, I'll try to make this really quick, is like because it has failed, it's trying to roll back. It's trying to say, okay, undo everything. We screwed up. But when it's doing that, it's basically doing a config import of what was previously there, the snapshot that it took before it applied. As it's trying to do that, it's validating that import before it does it, and that validation is then failing. So it's failing to roll back after failing to apply. What I usually do, to be honest with you, is I go into core and I just like comment out a line, and I make it show me the real exception, and then I can start tracing it. But that sucks. So yeah, we have to work that.
We do have an issue in the queue. So we have messaging. We have verbose output when you're applying a recipe. And it goes to the config action section, and then the verbosity stops. So we do have an issue to continue adding more and more documentation to the application process. So hopefully that would help too, because it would work up to a certain point, and then that's where it failed. So hopefully that issue can get addressed one of these days.
Someday.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know that Drush site install could take a recipe. Kind of a two-part question. Is there a different kind of command structure for that, or you just, from provided a directory to a recipe, a name to a recipe?
Yeah, no, with Drush site install, it's the path to the recipe.
Okay. And does it, behind the scenes, install like the minimal profile first, or does it just apply recipes and you don't need to?
It's yeah. When that change was made in Drupal core does allow null as an install profile now. So yeah, you don't have to even install minimal.
What about like development process and development tools? Are there like, is there any way to validate the file as you go along, or is there like a process to kind of go piece by piece so you don't have these big failures after you're kind of done? Is there a way to kind of fail small, step by step, and fix errors as you go, or what's the process like?
Sure.
What are the tools? Like,
Sure.
do you set breakpoints and debug, or like what kind of tools or processes can developers use?
Great question. What kind of developer tools are there? None. Yeah, not many. No. There is. Somebody made a VS Code plugin that helps you with like your structure. There is a Drush generator that help you like create to start. But usually, I set up 2 sites. And I have one that I'm creating the recipe on, and one that I'm applying the recipe on, and then I'm Drush site installing and reapplying the recipe and reapplying the recipe. So yeah, I mean, building it out, commenting things out, and doing it little by little is the only way right now. It's so complex, we don't want to create any UI for creating recipes or any tooling till it's stable. Like, yeah, so like all of this is in core as experimental. You know, like I said, it's been 10 months since it's all been in core. So yeah, people keep asking for features like tools that you could just export and you'll have a recipe. Like until then, like it's kind of like learn how to make the recipe. It'll make you stronger developer. Yes, learn to cry like we do. Like, I didn't touch this config. What's wrong? So, yeah. And then you'll know. Then you'll be a pro recipe developer, and hundreds of thousands of people will use your recipe. Awesome. Well, it looks like people are standing in the hall getting ready for us. So thank you all for coming.